Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is, well, it's a profound paradox playing out across the globe. The intense economic disruption often caused by populist policies, and yet the surprisingly robust political longevity of the leaders driving those policies.
Yeah, it's in real tension.
Exactly. We're examining this tension using the current volatility surrounding Javier Milei in Argentina as our main case study, really, but also drawing comparisons to global figures like, Trump, Farage, and Meloni.
Right.
And the core question before us is, I think, critical for understanding modern political economy. Does the sustained success and appeal of contemporary populism fundamentally rely on addressing deep economic grievances, that feeling that the system has structurally failed, or is the key to their survival more about charismatic, anti-establishment political appeals that somehow insulate them from the inevitable economic costs they impose?
A crucial distinction.
I will be arguing that fundamentally, economic failure and the promise of radical economic rescue remain the driving foundational force for populism. Their rise and ultimately their fall are determined by the material reality they promise to fix.
And I'll be taking the contrasting view. While, yes, economic despair certainly cracks the door open for these movements, I think the political durability, their unique ability to remain in power, hinges far more on non-economic, anti-establishment rhetoric. And it's this rhetorical skill, this political maneuvering, that allows them to survive the, frankly, profound economic disaster their policies often precipitate.
Okay, so let me lay out my perspective. The initial traction for really any powerful populist movement is rooted squarely in tangible material dissatisfaction. We just can't ignore the context here. Global citizens have lived through decades of, stagnant living standards for many, the really painful fallout of the 2008 financial crisis where ordinary citizens, not the banks, absorbed the costs, followed by the economic dislocations of the pandemic, the Ukraine war. This combination results in sluggish wage growth, surging prices, and frankly, profound public anger. Populism flourishes in this environment, which the source material accurately describes as fertile ground. Voters are turning to leaders who promise muscular, decisive economic disruption, precisely because they feel rotten about the economy and they believe the established parties failed them structurally. Now, take Milei. His commitment to extensive privatizations and deep public spending cuts, that shock therapy approach, was initially lauded by the IMF precisely because it aimed to tackle Argentina's triple-digit inflation head-on. His ideological affinity for figures like, say, Margaret Thatcher signals this commitment to radical economic reform. So I see why you might focus on Milei's charisma, but let me offer this perspective. Voters are demanding economic disruption from these figures because they've lost faith that the mainstream can deliver material security. The systemic economic failure is the reason they rise in the first place.
The systemic economic failure is the reason they rise in the first place? Okay, I understand that view, but I come at it from a different angle. Your point really hinges on the idea that the promise of economic reform drives support and that outcomes eventually matter most. If that were entirely true, if economic outcomes were the ultimate measure, then you'd expect many populist leaders to fail and be removed pretty quickly once the economic pain actually starts.
Right, you'd think so.
Yet, the empirical data challenges this view quite profoundly. There's a significant paper analyzing 51 populist presidents and prime ministers between 1900 and 2020, and it found that, wow, yes, they lead to profound economic disintegration, resulting in GDP per head being about 10% lower after 15 years. These leaders remain in power for 8 years on average. Now that's twice as long as their more moderate equivalents, who typically last only about 4 years.
That is a striking statistic.
It's astonishing, right? And it strongly suggests their appeal reaches beyond mundane economics. Their success seems to rely much more on this charismatic, iconoclastic disruption and, frankly, skilled political maneuvers rather than detailed policy competence or positive economic results. Look at the current situation in Argentina. Milei's policies, like the currency cap and reduced tariffs, have already caused a massive recession. I mean, we're talking about 18,000 business closures, over 250,000 registered job losses, according to SIPA data. Argentina has become the most expensive country in South America. The very fact that his project is surviving this level of immediate economic catastrophe, a situation so severe that massive financial intervention was needed just to avert a full-blown currency crisis, well, it suggests his continued political success is somehow insulated from economic reality by a kind of non-economic shield.
I appreciate the focus on that 8-year longevity figure. It's compelling. But we have to link that durability back to the material constraints. Milei's specific crisis isn't accidental. It's a direct consequence of his economic prescription. As critics, including local textile industrialist groups, have pointed out, his government's only achievement is containing inflation at the cost of a major recession. This extreme cost confirms that economics remains the central field of conflict here. He can't escape the reality of debt, reserves, price stability. If he devalues the currency, as many analysts predict he must after the election, inflation will soar again. That defines his political fate through an unavoidable economic dilemma. If his core promise to stabilize the economy is fundamentally broken, his support base, which was initially driven by anger over economic instability, will, I argue, eventually evaporate.
The cost is high, yes, but the fact that the cost must be reckoned with means the economic variables are fundamentally in charge of his destiny.
That's a compelling argument about the constraints. But have you considered that the entire populist strategy might be explicitly designed to externalize, blame, and deflect accountability for precisely those economic realities? I mean, maybe this isn't a bug in their system. Maybe it's the core political maneuver. When the recession hits, the populist doesn't necessarily own it. They blame the stodgy establishment, the deep state, international cabals, you name it.
The scapegoating mechanism.
Exactly. Take Nigel Farage, for instance. His package isn't just about specific policies. It's about promising disruption, promising to take back control, railing against institutions like the Bank of England. This political focus allows them, quite effectively sometimes, to sweep away doubts about the economic details. If he blames bureaucrats and globalists for the lack of jobs, he can potentially maintain his support base, even as economic indicators worsen. This political skill lets him define the argument as being about loyalty to the people versus betrayal by elites, effectively changing the subject from economic competence to establishment sabotage. And furthermore, if economic credibility were truly paramount, many of these populist platforms would, frankly, collapse instantly due to internal policy contradictions. Joe Michaud points out this tension in Farage's proposals. On one hand, you have his rich backers demanding deep deregulation and massive tax cuts.
On the other, you have the narrative of bringing back British jobs and reindustrialization for the working class. These two policy goals fundamentally clash, don't they?
They certainly seem to.
So if voters were purely rational actors focused only on coherent economic policy, that inherent incoherence should lead to immediate political failure.
I'm skeptical, though, that voters ignore these contradictions indefinitely. And I'm not fully convinced by that line of reasoning because the markets do react strongly to policy, forcing populists to adjust their political rhetoric and their platforms, thereby, I think, confirming the primacy of those material constraints. The political maneuver of externalizing blame might work on the street, perhaps, for a time, but it often fails in the financial centers. We saw this reality check play out very clearly in the UK recently. Farage's own deputy admitted they were forced to shift their rhetoric to focus on public spending cuts, specifically because they were wary of being accused of planning a Liz Truss-style splurge, which was, let's remember, a political and financial disaster caused by unfunded tax promises.
True, the market reaction was severe.
Right, and Michelle confirms this material reality. With they implemented massive tax giveaways without a credible funding plan, the markets would, quote, puke. This volatility shows that the policy adjustment happens not necessarily because of voter outcry over a contradiction, but because of direct pressure from international investor confidence. So populists, even when they're selling pure charisma, must ultimately navigate the hard reality of debt, borrowing, and fiscal stability.
That constraint dictates their policy flexibility, and I think that confirms the primacy of material concerns over pure rhetorical skill.
Okay, I agree that the market response is a powerful external constraint. It's certainly a financial reality check. But I'd argue that market pressure only proves that political survival often trumps ideological purity for these leaders. When faced with the market's ultimatum, the populist leader adjusts the policy, often quietly, sacrificing maybe the economic detail but never sacrificing the anti-establishment political narrative that grants them that longevity we talked about. The priority seems to be political retention, not necessarily economic consistency.
Intellectual disagreement definitely sharpens understanding, but let's circle back to that longevity finding, the 8 years compared to 4. If they are so skilled at deflection and political survival, why only 8 years on average? Why not longer? I'd argue that this 8-year figure actually indicates the profound depth of the existing economic anger and the perceived lack of credible structural alternatives from the mainstream. That fertile ground we mentioned, created by stagnant living standards and the widespread feeling of being structurally impoverished, is so wide and deep that it provides immense political capital to anyone promising radical surgery. So the 8 years could be seen as a measure of mainstream system failure, not necessarily proof of populist policy success or purely political skill.
That's an interesting point, framing the 8 years as a sign of system failure, though I would still frame it differently. The difference between 4 years and 8 years is massive in political terms. It's often the difference between a single term and achieving real institutional control or change. This longevity, for me, highlights the specialized political skill populists possess in managing, or at least surviving, economic failure. The source material does highlight that the appeal of successful populists reaches beyond mundane economics. Consider Giorgia Meloni in Italy. She quite quietly dropped earlier radical calls to leave the euro, which was arguably a sensible, economically stabilizing choice she made once in power. But she successfully maintained and even grew her support by shifting focus, successfully appealing to cultural and identity issues, specifically blaming immigration for many of Italy's struggles. This ability to make economically responsible adjustments to avoid market panic, while simultaneously shifting the political focus entirely onto cultural scapegoating, that seems to be the key that allows them to survive the economic disintegration identified by the researchers Funke, Schulark, and Trebisch. Their political expertise and narrative control feels like the true determinant of their survival, regardless of the heavy economic price paid by citizens, like that Argentine industrialist mentioned earlier.
Well, this debate certainly illustrates that populist movements are powerful precisely because they diagnose, often accurately, a real structural economic problem. That systemic failure that leaves so many feeling, well, rotten. The radical policy decisions they make, be it Milei's dramatic cuts or Trump's aggressive use of tariffs, are fundamental, I believe, to the success or ultimate failure of their project, even when those decisions result in high, immediate costs for the populace. Economic reality remains the crucial testing ground.
And while economic pain is undeniably the catalyst, the spark for the populist wave, the empirical evidence does demonstrate that these leaders are uniquely skilled at holding on to power for extended periods, often despite presiding over demonstrably poor economic performance. Their core expertise seems to lie in utilizing charisma and that potent anti-establishment rhetoric to withstand institutional erosion and economic disintegration, appealing to sentiments that often seem impervious to immediate financial setbacks.
So I think both of our positions confirm that understanding modern populism really requires separating the fundamental economic drivers of its initial rise from the often sophisticated political mechanisms of its retention of power.
Indeed. And there is clearly much more to explore in how these powerful forces interact. The sheer depth of the economic anger meeting the depthness of the political manipulation. Especially, I think, when you have a charismatic leader like Milei pushing the doctrine of radical economic disruption to its absolute limit. It's a dynamic we'll be watching closely.